Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton. Today we have another discussion with Ken Griffith on his revised chronology for the ancient world, and particularly Egypt and its relationship to the history described in the Bible. Before we get into today's discussion, let me just make a note that in the pinned comment, you can see a link to my book, Christ in All Things, Essays in Scripture and Theology, which is a compilation of extended essays that I wrote over a number of years on biblical studies, exegesis, and other matters. You can also sign up for my ongoing series of exclusive lectures where you can also submit questions, answering Judaism's rejection of Jesus, at the link below, seraphimhamilton.com. So with that said, let's get into today's discussion. Ken, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So we are approaching the end of Egyptian history now. So as we kind of see the end of the tunnel, would you just briefly summarize for the audience why it is that Manetho's dynasties are out of chronological order in your mind?
Okay. First, you need to see the geography of Egypt and the cities. As we discussed in past episode, we believe that the sons of Mizraim founded between 5 and 7 founding cities of Egypt, and that each of these cities had dynasties of their own. Basically, the mayor was the king of town, and that Manetho, we believe he listed the dynasties in order based on when they achieved power in Egypt generally, but as you get to the later period, it's not always a strict rule that he followed. So let's look at the cities real quick. From south to north, you have Elephantine, was kind of the far south border of Egypt at the cataract of the Nile. You had Thebes, which is just upstream of the Bend. Nakada was an early city that is found in the pre-dynastic era. That appears a lot of the very early material comes from Nakada. Thinis was the first dynasty that ruled the others, and also a lot of the original oldest pre-dynastic material has come from the graves in this area. Heracleopolis Magna, that's what the Greeks called it. Off the top of my head, I don't recall the Egyptian name, but this city was near the entrance to the Fayum Oasis, which at other times in history was probably a lake. And then Memphis was the great capital city at the when it was built, according to Herodotus, it was at the mouth of the Nile and there was no delta. And actually, this is what the priest told Herodotus, was that when Memphis was built by Menes, there was no delta. But by the time of Pharaoh Morris, who is Sesostris I, the pharaoh that we identify as Joseph's pharaoh, the delta had grown all the way to the point about this far out. And we believe the 14th dynasty had been basically founded, or at least given to the Israelites, and it was based in the city of Sais or Zoas, which is here in the middle of the delta. And then by the time of Herodotus' time, the delta had pretty much reached its current size. So given that geography, here's a very interesting thing. We believe that the Old and Middle Kingdoms were basically the Ice Age, and that the Sahara was very green, and there's a lot of archaeological evidence in the Sahara that it was lush and green, and there are petroglyphs that people were out here herding animals and hunting. And so early in Egypt's history, Thinis and Thebes were pretty close to the center of population because this supported a large population. But later, as the climate changed and the Sahara dried up, which we believe would have happened after the Exodus and maybe even after King David's time, so maybe after 1000 BC. This no longer supports much population at all because it's a desert with blowing sands, and the delta has grown, and at its current size, the delta is more than twice the arable land than the entire rest of the Nile Valley combined. So what we will see is the power shifts from the south to the north as the population of the delta grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the Greek and then the late period, all the ruling dynasties are here, and Thebes has just become kind of a relict, almost the necropolis, the city of the dead. It's where you put your tomb, but it basically was no longer powerful. It may have been historically important, but it wasn't powerful. So let's look at I'm going to scroll down. It's hard to show this in one screen. So I'm going to scroll down from 2191 BC, showing the dynasties. And what we're going to see is these are Upper Egypt, except for Memphis. And then to the right, everything right of here is Lower Egypt. And we're going to see that the power moves from the left to the right as we go down through time. So here we have the first dynasty, the third and the ninth are in three different cities of Thinis, Memphis, and Heracleopolis. And you had a war here, which caused the break. So the first broke to become the second of the same city, and the third in Memphis was followed by the fourth in Memphis, and then the fifth, and then the sixth, and it goes on down to the eighth, one solid string. And then he goes back to the beginning again with the ninth dynasty and the 10th. And Manetho lists the 11th as lasting 43 years, but the number of kings he gives, given the average number, we think it actually went back, and Thebes was actually founded roughly around the same time as the other three. But the 11th, that's counted officially as the duration, was only 43 years, and then the 12th dynasty. And then we place this as the reign of Pharaoh Morris. And in his reign, we had a kind of a shakeup with the Great Famine. And we have him establishing the 13th dynasty, which we think was the position that Joseph held as Euphne, who's listed in the Turin canon. And the 14th dynasty may have started earlier, but we believe that basically was the dynasty in Goshen that Jacob was one of the early kings of. And his seal has been found as Yaqub Har. Yaqub Har means Jacob the Great. So we scroll on down. We're starting to see these dynasties appearing in the Delta now. And we get to 1491, the Exodus, and that the 12th dynasty died out without an heir. The 13th had kind of filled in the gap there. After the Exodus, you have the Hyksos invasion, and they establish a vassal dynasty in Thebes, the 16th dynasty, and a vassal dynasty also in Memphis, which is the 8th. And the 15th is their main base in the city of Avaris. Well, the 13th continues, apparently serving the 15th dynasty. They're acting as the viziers of Egypt, kind of like they had before, and the 14th also continues. But now they have basically Edomite or Amalekite kings. So we continue the string down from the 16th all the way down to the 20th. So that's the longest stretch of a single city, Thebes, in Manetho's list. And we also have this central section of Egyptian history where, at least from Manetho's list, we only appear to have one dynasty. I'm sure these other cities had kings, but for whatever reason, the 18th dynasty is the only one that appears to have been worthy of mention. So we have the Amarna what I call the Amarna which would be Akhenaten, Nefertiti, his two sons, Menkaure, and then Tutankhamun, and then I. And by the end of this period, Horemheb kind of cleans it up. And then we have in our chronology that we've discussed, the gap. We've got the 22nd dynasty, which is found in Manetho's 18th dynasty list as several of the names in the list. And then we have the 25th dynasty, who also conquered, and they're also listed in the 18th dynasty by Manetho. At least two kings from the 25th dynasty. And then we get the Assyrian invasion, which establishes the 26th and 19th. And the 20th comes all the way down to the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus. And then he puts the 21st, which is also around the same time, in a different city, Tanis. So this is Thebes, this is Tanis. And then he goes back and he lists because the power is shifting to the Delta, he goes back and he lists the Delta cities, starting with Dynasty 22 in Bubastis, 23 in Tanis, 24 in Zoas, 26 in Zoas. And then the remainder of these dynasties are new cities being founded in the Delta. So you've got Mendes was the 29th dynasty, Sebenitis, and this is during the time of the Persian Empire. Between these two lines, this is the Persian first invasion by Cambyses, and the Persians ruled Egypt for about 120 years, 110. And then the Egyptians gained independence, which is the main 20th dynasty. But then the Persians reconquered Egypt for about a little less than a decade before Alexander invaded. And Alexander was viewed as the great liberator by the Egyptians. Um, so we therefore have the Ptolemaic dynasty starting with him, but the 20th and 21st appear to be still active until about the third king of the Greek dynasty. So that's how we view it. That's what we think was Manetho's method, is that he's basically listing dynasties by city in the order that they received power, with a few exceptions.
Thank you. So in this model, we've covered in our series um, dynasties 1 to 19, and then we talked about dynasty 26. So on this model, uh, dynasties 22 to 25 actually come before dynasty 19. So could you explain why you group them together in this way? That is, why you put 22 to 25 together as a single set, and where you place them in relation to the 18th and 19th dynasties.
Okay. Well, we don't really lump them as a set. We simply used synchronisms, external synchronisms, to place them, and this is just kind of how it came out. Um, so over here on my chart, we have this down at the bottom. These are the kings of Thebes, and the main dynasty 18 we have in orange, and then what we call 18B is crosshatched. Those are the last 9 kings in Manetho's list that we believe were from Dynasty 22 and also the Ethiopians. Um, so we have it crosshatched because the mainstream chronology basically ignores those 9 kings as if they didn't happen. Um, and here again is the 9 kings. So here's Akhenaten in Manetho, and then we've got the 9 kings after him. And we have the last two reign over 100 years. We have this Ramses Egypticus, also called Harmesis Miamun, and it's assumed by a lot of chroniclers, even revisionists, that this was Ramses II of Dynasty 19. We argue that that is not, that this is actually Pianki, the Ethiopian king, and that he may not have actually stayed in Egypt 68 years. He stayed 30 years, and we think he went back to Ethiopia. And in the intervening 30 years, the other dynasties continued paying him tribute, and we're happy that he didn't come back. So he ended up getting credited with 68 years. I don't know if he lived that long.
Did he
But
have
then
Ramses as a throne name?
that's a problem. So he used a lot of different throne names. He even used the full titulature, all 5 names of Tutmos III in one of his inscriptions in Ethiopia. So he used Miamun as part of his throne name, and that was also part of Ramses II's. And I think both the length of his reign and the fact that he used Miamun are what confused people. Um, so we'll get back to him in a minute. Let me go ahead and go back to the gap. Um, so you've got this gap, and we know that the village in the Valley of the Kings, the village of the tomb makers, that it was pretty much active from Dynasty 18 all the way down to Dynasty 20. And so we would expect that if these two dynasties really did kind of fill this gap in between this part of 18 and the start of 19, then there should also be evidence of that in the Valley of Kings. And as it turns out, there is evidence of that. There's 2 tombs in the Valley of Kings, KV 40 and KV 64, and they both have burials from the time of Amenhotep III, which is what most scholars would consider late 18th dynasty, and Dynasty 22, which they say are intrusive burials. But usually when you talk about an intrusive burial, you have evidence that someone dug a new hole and buried someone else in an old graveyard. In this case, these 2 tombs were pretty jumbled up. So the bigger one was KV 40, and it had 50 mummies in it, and it was totally had been trashed by the tomb raiders. And so they basically, the archaeologists have gone through the pots, the pottery, and the linen from the mummies, and they've found cartouches in there and writing, and basically enough for them to say these were daughters and children from the time of Amenhotep, basically royal family members who were being buried here. But also Dynasty 22 princesses were also being buried here. So we find a continuity of purpose that between Dynasty 18 and 22, they're both using the same tomb for the same purpose, which is specifically women and children from the royal family. And that suggests that there was knowledge, because if someone just randomly found a tomb 600 years later, which is how far they put Dynasty 22 after Dynasty 18, the idea that they would go in and use the tomb for the same purpose, as opposed to just being, hey, here's a tomb we can use, let's bury our king in here. um, so the fact that it's princesses and children of the royal family strongly suggests to me that there's a continuity, and in our chronology, these early Dynasty 22 kings, Shoshank I and Osorkon, they are about 50, 60 years after Amenhotep. And if Amenhotep had daughters even late in his life, which he appears to have had a pretty big harem, and he was having a lot of daughters and, well, children, it's very likely that some of them could have outlived him by 60, even 80 years. So it's possible that these Dynasty 18 and 22 burials were only, a few decades apart. Um, so another point that shows the continuity, we think, is this alleged forgery called Turin Stela 1476. Let's go back to my chart and then I'll explain it. So in the chart, we're saying that Pianki conquered, he's Dynasty 25. He's also, today they call him Pi. They've decided that the ANKH is not pronounced as Ankh, it's pronounced as I. So Pi, or Pianki, we believe he invaded in 778, which is about 30 years earlier than conventional scholars date him. And we have several durations that lock that in. And then he basically, the next generation came in 710 BC with Shebitku, his son, and Taharka was also his son, but Taharka was a prince who was kind of an army commander working for his brother Shebitku. And there's this daughter of his named Amenertis, Shepenwepet, who she becomes the high priestess of the god Amun, and she apparently also married three of the kings of Dynasty 25. We think there's evidence that she was the successive wife of Shebitku, Shabaka, and then Taharka. And she adopted Taharka's daughter, Amenertis, as her successor. I think the successor as priestess when she became the wife of Shabaka, or it could be that when Shebitku got killed, she might have actually reigned as king for a little while. And that's something that Velikovsky theorized. We're not sure, because of where the chroniclers put Tausret, Tausret, or some people pronounce her as Tau Raset. She is in the 19th dynasty, but she in some of the chroniclers, she also appears in the 25th. So some put her down here at the end, some put her here, or there may have been two different women who used that title. So it could be that Tazret was a title used by Shepenwepet. So the reason this is relevant to the question is this was found by well, it was purchased on the market in Egypt in the 1800s, and Flinders Petrie decided it was a fake. But what it shows is it shows Shabaka and I think Taharka, either that or Shebitku and Shabaka. And it shows Shepenwepet and it shows Amenertis, and it has their names written above them. But Shepenwepet is depicted as a king, even as a man, although her name says Shepenwepet, which is a known woman. And then above her is the symbol of these three serpents. And that symbol is so rare, it's only found in the tomb of Seti I. And of course, conventional chronology places Shepenwepet as 600 years after Seti I. And so it has been declared a forgery for two reasons. She's depicted as a man, and it has a symbol that is an anachronism because they say that symbol was only used in the 19th dynasty 600 years earlier. Well, in our chronology, we find that when the Ethiopians ruled, Shepenwepet may have actually had a short period where she actually was ruling as a king. and that might explain her depiction as a man and depiction with royal honors in that on that stela. And the second thing is, we know from history that when let's see, what I look for. Here it is. Okay, at the beginning of Dynasty 19 and 26, or at least of 26, we know that Psammetichus, when he conquered the Ethiopians, he apparently Taharka had fled and left everybody behind. So, basically, Psammetichus and the Assyrians captured Shep-en-Wepet and Amenertis, and Psammetichus forced Amenertis to adopt his own daughter as the high priestess of Amun. And there's a record of that from the year 663 BC. So we have not only did they live at the same time, but there actually was a transaction where both Shep-en-Wepet and Amenertis had to adopt Seti's daughter, and so we know that they were in the same place at the same time. And therefore, the fact that Seti's tomb, and he died, I guess he died about 80 years later, not 80 years, 50 years later, his tomb having that symbol would happen to be roughly the same time as within a few decades after they had lived and been in that situation that's depicted on the stele. So rather than the stele being a forgery because it's anachronistic, we actually find that Shep-en-Wepet, Amenertis, and Seti, who we identify Semiticus as Seti, they were all in the same place at the same time, and therefore it's not an anachronism. And the other question would be, how would someone in the mid 1800s in Egypt know enough to forge something like this? If you're going to make a forgery, you make a forgery because you want to sell it to get money. And if you're going to sell it to get money, you want to make a forgery of something that's popular and well known. It would be very kind of weird for a forger to forge something that's so arcane like this, that uses a symbol that almost nobody else has ever heard of, about people that aren't very well known either. So that's we would view this as a possible confirmation from archaeology that's been declared a forgery because it doesn't fit the known chronology. Let's see. Hopefully that's kind of an overview. I guess dynasties 22 and 24, I could explain that real quick. So we have dynasty 23 basically being established in the city of Tanis at at the same time that Taharka was established as the vassal. So Shabiku invades Egypt again after his dad, Pianki, dies, and he establishes Taharka, his little brother, as kind of the vassal who's ruling either the Delta or possibly even Thebes, while Shabiku is basically ruling in both Napata, which is in Ethiopia, or what was then Ethiopia, as well as in Thebes. But apparently Shabiku got killed by Shabaka, and Shabaka is his uncle, and Shabaka takes over. But Taharka manages to basically stay in power as the vassal of his uncle. And then later Shabaka dies, and then Taharka becomes the high king. At the same time, a little bit before that, you had Dynasty 24 in the Delta. That's contemporary with Pi during his reign. But when Shabitku came, he burned the last king of this dynasty named Bakoris or Bakenref. He burned him alive. And it's believed that Dynasty 26 are descended from this guy. And so when we see later the battles between Dynasty 26 and 25 to control Egypt, it's bitter. And the reason it's bitter probably is because the Dynasty 25 kings had burned the grandfather of the kings of Sais, who would become Nico I and Psammetichus I. So that basically explains our view of where it fits between 18 and 19, what was happening there. Basically, the Amarna breakdown led to Egypt fragmenting. And then first you had the Libyans who controlled the Delta, taking claim over all of Egypt. And then you had the Ethiopians who saw the chaos and they said, no, we're going to, apparently Pi was very religious for the god Amun, and he was very insistent on reestablishing the proper worship of Amun. So that may have been part of his motivation. But it was the breakdown of the Amarna apostasy, if you will, that led to this fragmentation of Egypt, and then different groups are all trying to control it. And it wasn't until Seti comes to power as Psammetichus and then Seti that he starts reestablishing his power. So we actually believe that he is the last king of also Dynasty 23 of the city of Bubastis. He established Asorkan I as his basically vassal in Bubastis and probably his ally. But after there's one generation after Asorkan I, and then there's this king called Zet in the list. And as it turns out, when we peg these, as we'll talk about in a minute, how we peg these chronologically, Zet dies the same year as Psammetichus, who dies the same year as Seti, which is 611 BC. Sorry, a little bit earlier than that. 611 BC, which would be right about here. So we think Seti basically is reuniting control over all of Egypt under his centralized authority. And so even though there are a few rump kings of Dynasty 22, it's no longer effectively an independent dynasty after he takes control. So next question.
Do you want to talk about the synchronisms between dynasties 22 and 23 to Assyrian history later when we talk about the triangulation, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's do that then.
Okay. So we've covered dynasties 22 to 25 as well as 18 and 19. So I know some people will be wondering where dynasties 20 and 21 fit into this model. We're going to have a whole episode on that. But would you just kind of sketch out where you think those fit?
Yes. Dynasty 20 is known from a papyrus called the Harris Papyrus. It also happens to be the longest papyrus ever found. It's many, many, many meters long. Um, and in this papyrus, I think it's Ramses the third, or his could be his nephew, is writing it as a justification of their kingship. But he basically says that the father of Ramses the third, which could mean father or could mean ancestor, like forefather, that in his time, Egypt was apparently ruled by these foreigners who have closed all the temples and they're taxing the people excessively and stealing everything, and there's no justice. And this, I think it's Setnacht. Yeah, I think the name of this liberator king who founds the 20th dynasty is Setnacht, and he drives the foreigners out, and then he reestablishes all the temples to be reopened and rebuilt. This Harris Papyrus fits very much the description that we see in the letter to Bagoas that we've talked about before. In the year 408 BC, the Jews living in the city of Elephantine had their temple attacked. They had a temple to Yahweh in Elephantine that was very ancient. And they wrote a letter to this Persian governor or satrap named Bagoas, who was ruling in Jerusalem, asking for money to rebuild their temple. And they give the backstory. They say when the Persians came under Cambyses, they knocked down all the temples in Egypt except our temple in Elephantine. And that would probably make sense because the Persians seem to have had, at least the early Persian emperors seem to have had a positive view of Yahweh, partly because, according to Josephus, they had read Cyrus the prophecy about him, and also that, well, that's a lot of speculation. At any rate, we have this history. We have a letter, and we have the original copy of the letter, not a later copy. That's the Jews of Elephantine saying the Persians knocked down all the temples of Egypt. And so that fits the description in the Harris Papyrus of these foreigners who are oppressing the religious worship in Egypt. And we believe that Dynasty 20 rebuilt all the temples. And so we aren't sure exactly where Manetho starts it, because he doesn't list the names of the kings. They've been dug up and found and assigned to Dynasty 20, but we're not really sure who Setnacht was. He might have been one of these, the king of Dynasty 28, 29 or 30, but probably 28. At any rate, he rebuilds all the temples, and this also causes part of the stratigraphy problem that we have for Egyptologists trying to figure out Egyptian chronology, is that there are lots of temples in Egypt that have Dynasty 20 foundations, and then they have Dynasty 22 material on top. And partly we believe that is because these guys were like archaeologists. They're rebuilding the temples that had been destroyed and trying to put these older pieces back in their places, or at least in a way that would work. So you end up with an inversion of the stratigraphy. Dynasty 21, Manetho lists in Tanis, so a different city than this one. And Velikovsky thought they were priest kings who they were the ones who collected all the mummies, rewrapped them, took all the gold and jewels out of them while they did it, and used it to finance their dynasty. But they also put all the mummies in a mummy cache, and that would make sense also because if you had this Persian period of dominating Egypt, it would be likely that the Persians would be happy to take a cut from the grave robbers who knew where their graves were. So you have Dynasty 21 trying to protect the mummies. So they're kind of grave robbers themselves because they are opening up the tombs and taking out all the valuables, but they're then rewrapping the mummies and putting and trying to protect them. The one evidence we have that Dynasty 21 has to be after 19 in our chronology is that one of the early kings of 21, whose name I think it might have been Susenus, but I could be wrong about that. He was buried. His tomb was found intact, and he was buried in the reused sarcophagus of Merneptah of Dynasty 19. So that forces us to place 21 after 19. But otherwise, there aren't a lot of strong external synchronisms to Dynasty 21. And that's I'll just say that's enough for this episode. We'll talk about that in the last episode.
Okay. Um, so could you give a general kind of sequence of events that you think happened between the Amarna Revolution of Akhenaten and the coronation of Seti the First in Dynasty 19?
Yes. So we have the what I call the Amarna set, which would be Akhenaten, who's followed by Nefertiti, who's followed by Smenkhare, who's followed by Tutankhamun, who's followed by his grandfather A. And currently, those are all given relatively short reigns. Given that the chroniclers give Akhenaten a longer reign, I suspect that he may have been deposed in his 18th or 19th year, but that he probably continued to live. He might have lived another 2 decades after that. Um, and then these are ruling in his place. But by the time of Smenkhare and Tutankhamun, apparently, perhaps there was a civil war, and then this allowed the the Libyans to come in. But Horemheb is apparently his general, and he appears to have tried to start cleaning up the mess and restoring the worship of Amun, and possibly he might be the one who scratched out a lot of the but there was a lot of effectively trying to erase the worship of Aten, and also even someone smashed Ai's coffin and appears to have defaced his tomb and defaced his references as well. Scholars think that was Horemheb. I don't think it's possible to be certain who it was. Um, one problem with Horemheb is we don't have any strong external synchronisms with him that make it certain that he was right after the Amarna set as opposed to right before Ramses. But right now, that's our best estimate of his correct placement is that he reigned. He may have reigned only 14 years, but he may have reigned longer than is assumed. They assume 14 because some of his grave goods have cartouches with year 14. The question is whether it was his year 14 or someone else's. Um, so we think that he died by around 815 BC, and then he was succeeded by Shoshank I. And we don't have a good portrait of Shoshank, but this is his description of his campaign. where he says that the god Amun gave him victory over the forces of Mitanni. Um, and we agree with Velikovsky, who identified Mitanni as the Aramean Hurrian coalition, which had a southern capital in Damascus and a northern capital in Washakani. And as we'll get to in the triangulation in a minute, we find that in 796 BC, Ashur-Nerari III, he had besieged and defeated Damascus. And we find in the Bible that Jeroboam II has this campaign where he retakes all this territory that Israel had lost to the Arameans from as far north as Hamath all the way down south to Edom. And then Shoshank won, and he's describing the same territory, and he's calling his enemy the forces of Mitanni. And so we believe that all three of them were basically allies in this campaign that ended the kingdom of Mitanni, or basically the Arameans, turned them into just a local small government as opposed to a large coalition. We think that the rump of Mitanni went to the north, and they ended up becoming the kingdom of Urartu, which appears shortly after this. So the second king of Dynasty 22 is Osorkon the First, and one of the questions is how long he ruled, because Manetho gives him 15, but monuments give him 35 years. And our theory is that his first 15 years, he ruled all of Egypt, but then Pianki came, basically invaded Egypt from the south, and that he became a vassal to Pianki for 20 years. But he was one of the kings listed in Pianki's stele of the ones who rebelled against him. And so we think he probably got killed by Pianki when he came in his year 20 campaign to the Delta, which we place as 758 BC. Again, we place that 30 years earlier than the conventional chronology does. So Pianki, or Pi, Meriamun, he's the one that we think is called Ramses Egypticus or Armesis Miamun in the 18th dynasty list. Is credited with 68 years. And he left this huge stele where he just tells a really long story about how he had to go conquer the Delta and who the kings were of all the different cities in the Delta. And that's where we are able to lock him in as the one who ended the reign of Osorkon the First. But he appears to have gone back to Napata and maybe been an absentee landlord for a while. But no one seems to have rebelled against him in that time that he was gone. So he's the father of the 25th dynasty ruler Shebitku and the woman Shepenwepet and Taharka. And he also has a younger brother named Shabaka. And all of these ended up ruling Egypt during Dynasty 25. So
Could I just ask, do you have a identification of King So of Egypt, to whom Hoshea wrote letters?
he would fit with Osorkon the second.
Okay,
But the problem with So is that's obviously an abbreviation, and you could argue that that could also be a Shoshank.
right.
So because both Shoshank and Osorkon were very popular names in Dynasty 22 and 23, that's not a strong synchronism to try to use to peg chronology, but at least your chronology should be able to support it. So we can say in our chronology, Osorkon II was ruling when So is mentioned in the Bible, and that's believable as who that was. Also, Ashurbanipal called him Shilkani, so that would also probably be Osorkon II.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think in the conventional model, it's Sorkon 4. So,
Did I
yeah.
say Ashurbanipal? I meant Sargon. I meant Sargon too.
Okay.
Sorry. Yep. Sargon is the one who called him Shilkani. Okay. So do you want to hear about Taharka?
I do.
Okay. Maybe let's see. Actually, I was going to get to that in a minute. Let's do the anchoring of the chronology to explain how we got these results for Dynasty 22 and 23. All right.
Okay.
So it's Ashurbanipal. He listed Petubast, actually Petubasti, as one of the governors of Egypt who paid tribute to him in 666 BC. Don't think it has anything to do with the beast. Sorry. Uh, but it just happened to be that year. So Petubast was a rare name, and there's only two kings known by this name. So you would think this would be a very good synchronism to use as a peg. So there's a Petubast one of Dynasty 23, and then there's a lesser Petubast who was mentioned by Pianki, but he was not king of um, Tanis, and Dynasty 23 ruled Tanis. So what we've noticed is that the conventional chronology, they hang their entire Dynasty 22 on the equation of Shoshank 1 with Shishak, and then Kitchen basically stretches it by using the longest possible interpretations and adding lots of extra later guys as kings of Dynasty 22. So he's able to stretch it to cover roughly twice the time period that it's allotted by Manetho, which is only 120 years. So we just went the other direction. We said, well, what if we just use the synchronisms that we have that are stated by third parties that are not as controversial? And Petubas is such an unusual name that this is a pretty good synchronism. So we said, what if the Petubast who paid tribute to Ashurbanipal was Petubast I of Dynasty 23? And we know that Ashurbanipal executed him either that year or the year after, because the governors of Egypt had rebelled against Ashurbanipal at the instigation of Taharka. So Ashurbanipal comes back a year later and he installs Nico. We believe he installed Nico as Ramses I, and he installed Psammetichus as governor, basically king of Dynasty 26. But then Nico gets murdered, and so Ashurbanipal comes back again, and this time he invades Thebes and he sacks Thebes, and he installs what we believe Psammetichus was installed as King Seti I of Thebes. But at this time, if we're trying to figure out Dynasty 23, that's a good time to say Osorkon III was installed as king of Tanis. We know that he was the one right after Petubast. And Osorkon III left a stele behind in which he said that he took the throne in year, I believe it was 39 of Shoshank III. And that is a wonderful synchronism that locks Dynasty 22 to Dynasty 23. So if we count down from there, if we count down Dynasty 23, the last king of the dynasty is Zet, Z-E-T, who we believe is Seti. That Seti basically took over the dynasty himself. And so, as I mentioned earlier, he's basically centralizing power. But if we count back the 39 years to Shoshank III, that enables us to use either Manetho's numbers or Kenneth Kitchen's numbers to count back to the founding of the 22nd dynasty. And if we use Manetho's numbers, one of the problems is that he says Osorkon the first reigned 15 years, and then three kings reigned for a certain number of years, like three kings at the same time. The monuments say Osorkon I reigned 35 years. So this creates a problem. How long did he really reign? If we use Manetho's number, we come out to Shoshank I taking the throne around 814 BC. And this places his, I guess, roughly year 20 campaign. It ends up matching, as I mentioned above, the campaign of Jeroboam and the Assyrian king to conquer Damascus. But this places Osorkon I, where his first 15 years are, so he's ruling over Egypt by himself. But then when Pianki comes and conquers, he basically submits to him for 20 years. And if you add 20 to 15, you get the 35 years that the monuments give for Osorkon II. So this kind of locks together. And then we also have a king Bakenref, who was the last king of Dynasty 24, and he's the one who got burned alive by Shabikku in 710. So we know when he got killed. And Manetho gives us a reign of either 44 or 6 years for him and 5 for his predecessor. And if we assume the 44 was the correct value, this places the reign of his father Tefnach as beginning in 758, which also matches Pianki's year 20 campaign. So again, it locks together. We're using the durations given by the chroniclers to decide when Pianki reigned, as opposed to just counting the monuments, which sometimes we don't have all the monuments.
Do
So
do you
monuments, yeah, go
do you
ahead.
by the way have slides for this? Just if you have
Right.
them.
Let's see. Fortunately, I've got the big picture slide, and I can go down. Yeah, nope. I don't actually have a good slide for that. I really
No, that's fine. I
apologize.
just wanted to make sure if you
Yeah.
had them that we had them up.
Okay. So let's see. Continuing that, um, those five pieces locked together, and that's how we reconstructed the chronology. So, and we ended up finding those three or four strong synchronisms. Um, and then there's one more piece, and that is that when Merneptah made his Israel steel in his fifth year, which we believe was 584 BC, he talks quite a bit about the Meshwesh, who are the Libyans, and he talks about how they had oppressed Egypt, and he finally basically finished them off. And in our chronology, um, that we've just put together using what the chroniclers are saying, we have Dynasty 23 ending. And, that I that's a mistake. It's supposed to end way up here. I just realized that I had an error in mine. At any rate, what we have is Dynasty 23 ends roughly at the time that Merneptah's older brother became king as Nico II. And that's the end of Dynasty 23. And then Merneptah ends up having this war with the Libyans 3 decades later. And so we think that what happened was after the Amarna era, you'd had the Libyans took over first the Delta, and then the Ethiopians took over Upper Egypt. And then when Seti finally regains control, he's basically trying to regain control over all of Egypt, and he's trying to regain control over the Delta, especially, which had been dominated by the Meshwesh, or the Libyans. So where I was going with that is that Merneptah is basically saying we finished off the Libyans. So that would suggest to me, and even though that goes against everything conventional history would say, that's telling he's saying that because it was the Libyans who had taken over the Delta after the Amarna people, and it was the 19th and 26th dynasties that had to reestablish control of the native Egyptians over the Delta, as well as over Thebes.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Could you then explain your view of Dynasty 25?
Okay. Um, we're pretty conventional on that with just a couple of small changes. So we view the reigns of Shabitku, Shabaka, and Taharka as the same as the conventional, with the possible small exception that we think that Taharka was acting as the prince or the vassal king of Egypt under his either his older brother Shabitku or his uncle Shabaka. So, and that's why we believe in the king list, which is your next question that I'm going to jump ahead to. He's listed as Amenaphis, the last king of Dynasty 18, and I'll wait a minute until we get to that, and then you can I'll give some really good reasons why. But the other differences we have for Dynasty 25 is that we have Pi invading Egypt 30 years earlier than the conventional history does. And we got that because of durations to him, not because, just they found some monuments and then they try to tack him on in front. Um, the only other really interesting thing I think we already covered with Shepin. Oh, okay. Here's one thing. So the conventional history says that there was Pi, and then there was a king named Kashta, Kashta, who they're not sure if he was before Pi or after Pi. And then you have the three conventional kings. And they say this because they found a pyramid in Napata, which just says Kashta, and they're not sure any more about him. But they know that I think he had a daughter named Amenertis. Yeah. And it's assumed that Pianki had a daughter named Shepenwepet, and then she adopted not Pi, Kashta's daughter Amenertis as high priestess of Amun. And then Amenertis must have adopted Shepenwepet too, who is assumed to be the daughter of Asorkin III. And then she's assumed to have adopted Amenertis too, who's the daughter of Taharka. And what we think is because they have the 23rd dynasty too far back, they've doubled these people. So Kashta means Cushite. And in the list for Dynasty 26, the first king is listed, or he's like a prepended king. He's not part of 26, but it lists him as Amaris the Kashite, or the Cushite, Amaris the Ethiopian. And based on the length of his reign and him immediately preceding Nico 1, we believe that's Taharka. And so Taharka, we find, is being called Amaris, which is probably the same as Amenophis, and he's being called the Ethiopian, which would in Greek would be um, the Kashite or Kashta. And so we think that they basically doubled up Shepenwepet and Amenertis. There was only one Shepenwepet and there was only one Amenertis, and that Kashta is Taharka, and he's the son of Pi or Pianki, and he married Shepenwepet kind of late in life, and she adopted his daughter Amenertis, and that's all. That's the only two people by that name that there are. So that's it for our interpretation of Dynasty 25. It's not terribly controversial.
So, could you then go into more about why you identify Taharka as Amenophis?
Definitely. And this is, I think, really important for locking in the end of Dynasty 18. So Manetho's Dynasty 18 ends with a 40-year reign of Amenophis, and then Josephus goes into this long story about Amenophis had this either a dream and he wanted to see the gods, but he has this dream or he's approached by a priest. Right in front of me, I don't have the different versions of the story, but Josephus lists three versions and Herodotus lists one version. And all these stories have something in common is that the king, due to some religious reason, he is told either by a priest or by the god to do something which is considered a religious offense, and he's afraid to do it. And most of the versions of it, he's to either kill the cripples and the lame, or he's to kill a certain class of priests. So he refuses to do it. And later in his reign, he encounters an invading army of Asiatics at either Pelusium or Avaris, both of which are different names for the border cities. And instead of going to war, he leaves his army to fight and he flees, and he leaves even his wife and child behind, and he flees to Ethiopia. But later, he and his son or nephew come back, and we see this story just so the three versions of Josephus. Two versions say it was Amenophis who did this, and the one version says it was Bocorus, and Bocorus is the last king of Dynasty 24. And so both of these references seem to be references to Taharka. As Herodotus tells us, this is what Taharka did. He fled from the battle of Pelusium, where against Esarhaddon, and he fled to Ethiopia and left his wife and child behind. So all four of these stories pretty much tell the same story, and the slight difference of having Bocorus mentioned on one of them at least tells us that we're in that same time frame. Uh, a second issue related to it is that a couple of these mention plague and lepers. And in one of the Egyptian stories of, I think it was Taharka, it says that he went up against the Assyrians or the Asiatics. And in the night, rats came and they chewed off all the sandals and bowstrings of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians fled. And it seems to kind of match the same story as the Bible telling about how to Sennacherib how his army just died in one night. And then we have something else that we place in this time period, which is this Suppiluliumus the first of the Hittites, who we've argued were the Medes, at least the later part of them. He receives this letter from a queen, Dakamunzu of Egypt, asking for a prince, and he sends a prince. The prince gets killed, and then he goes to war with the Egyptians, but he and his son contract a plague from the Egyptians, and both of them die. And then his son, I think Mursilis II, ends up succeeding him. So we have this connection all in this time period. Is there's this king, there's plague, there's lepers, there's this discussion of plague, and there's this discussion of rats. And I'm kind of synthesizing all this to suspect that Egypt had a problem with the plague. It might have been bubonic plague, it might have been something else, and that this might have lasted for most of Taharka's reign, and that later when Esarhaddon starts fighting the Egyptians, um, he installed these kings, basically these governors in Lower Egypt, but Taharka had fled, and Taharka and his son come back. And when they came back, I think they didn't just stop in the Delta. I think they went all the way to Carchemish because Taharka had designs on being a great emperor, and he wanted to conquer all the land that the old Egyptian emperors had ruled all the way to Carchemish, which is up on the Euphrates. So I think they went up and they did a raid against Carchemish to try to take it back from the Assyrians, to teach the Assyrians a lesson. And that's where Suppiluliumus comes in, because his son had been basically installed as the king of Carchemish, and he's ruling as a vassal of the Assyrians, and so he ends up fighting the Egyptians directly. And that in the process, whatever plague had been afflicting Egypt that led to this whole thing of expelling the lepers, that plague was passed to the Hittites slash the Medes, and thus the story and the death of Suppiluliumus and Arnawanda I or Arnawanda II. So I know that's all kind of jumbled together a little bit, but the four stories of the king who fled from the battle, that so very clearly identifies Amenhotep, the last king of Dynasty 18, as the same man as Taharka. And we also have the chronology otherwise puts him in that exact time slot. So that's why we believe that Taharka was Amenhotep.
So, how do you celebrate or separate Suppiluliumus the first from Suppiluliumus who wrote to Akhenaten?
So the Suppiluliumus, what a
Great
horrible
name.
name, who wrote to Akhenaten. Um, poor king probably had a lot of jokes made about his name. Anyway, the letters between him and Akhenaten talk about good relationships between him and Egypt. The Suppiluliumus I, who we believe is more than a century and a half later, he mentions in his annals that he'd never had known good relationships with Egypt. So this is a contrast, suggesting that it's actually two different people. And we find some other problems. The Suppiluliumus the first has a different name of his son that he installed in Carchemish. The one who wrote to Akhenaten and had the treaty with Shadiwaza, his son was named Piasili, and he made him king of Carchemish. And Piasili is listed by Shalmaneser as Pasiri, and so is Suppiluliumus as two of the kings that Shalmaneser defeated in his first campaign in 859 BC. Whereas the son of Suppiluliumus is called, I think, Shari Kush. And the conventional scholars just assume Piasiri and Shari Kush are the same person, but usually the person won't have two different names in the same language. We'll find a lot of cases of king having different names in different languages, but we don't think that Shari Kush and Paiseri are the same person. We think that they are different people, different sons, and they lived in different eras.
So, would you then discuss the problems with Ahab and Jehu?
Sure. So the conventional, even Christian chronology is heavily based on um, the book by Edwin Thiele called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. And he followed his, I guess, mentor, Dr. Albright, in identifying the there's a recording of the Battle of Karkar um, by Shalmaneser III, and I believe it was in his 5th year, might have been his 4th year. And he basically says that there were these several kings against him. He lists the different kings, and one of them is Yalb Srilit, and that has been assumed to be Ahab of Israel. And so they peg Ahab's death to Shalmaneser's whatever 5th or 6th year. And the problem is that that is actually 44 years later than the biblical chronology seems to suggest Ahab lived. Um, and usually the scholars who make that equation don't really ask the question, why do we assume that Yalb Srilit had to be Ahab of Israel? Could it have been someone else? Srilit doesn't even look, I mean, it could be Israel, but how, I'm not really sure that it is, because the Assyrian name for Israel was Bit Cumri, and all the other references they have, they call him the king of Bit Cumri. So Srilit is kind of an anachronism in terms of a name for Israel by the Assyrians. And the second thing is that there was a king, Sargon II, about 130 years later. He fought the same city of Karkar, and his enemy, the leader of this coalition, is called Yalbdi. And this suggests that Yalb is a dynastic name or title for kings of the city of Karkar, as opposed to being the king of Israel being way out of his range. Another possibility is that the Yal could be a reference to one of the later people, because there's Jehu, there's Jehoahaz, there's Jehoahash. There's several people in the line of Jehu who, according to like the Usher Jones chronology, should be the people that are at the same time as Shalmaneser III, who that Yal could be any of their names, but that's even assuming that it's an Israelite king at all. So we think that's a super weak synchronism that's being misinterpreted, and it has distorted um, basically the history of the relationship between Israel and Assyria. And then you have the same issue with tribute paid by Jehu to Shalmaneser on the Black Obelisk. It's assumed to have been Jehu because it just says Yao, but it could again, it could be Jehoahaz, it could be Jehoahash, it could be any of the Yao based name kings of Israel. And then the third problem with this is that Shalmaneser records his defeat of Hazael, and he also records the death of Hazael. And if I remember right, it might be 642 or 641 BC. And we know that Hazael lived through 3 different kings of Israel, and we know the lengths of their reigns. So Hazael had to have reigned about 40 years plus. And there's no way that that fits him with him dying in at that time in Shalmaneser's reign with the others. So it suggests that the scholars have basically made 2 synchronisms based on weak name associations instead of stronger chronological durations. So it turns out some scholars saw this 100 years ago, and Gerard Gerteau has written some good work on this, and he has basically supported something closer to the Usher Jones interpretation.
So finally, you have some ideas about the origin of the Mede dynasty and its connection to Sargon as well as the Hittites. Could you explore those ideas?
Sure. Um, the foundation of the Medes is connected to the Cimmerians and connected to Sargon. and that's also connected to the Assyrian deportations of the Israelites. So Tiglath-Pileser III was the first Assyrian king who deported the tribe of Naphtali and Manasseh. Um, and then Shalmaneser V and Sargon II were the kings who finished the job, and they basically deported all the rest of the Israelites. And they planted them in various parts of the Assyrian Empire, which are listed in scripture. Um, the Assyrians called the Israelites Bit Cumri, which means house of Omri, which is kind of an insult because Omri was not a good king. But that's the name that stuck. And there's a guy named Raymond Capt who he's a British Israelite, and we reject British Israelism as a doctrine. I guess I should explain that. British Israelites think that the 10 tribes of Israel that got deported, they basically migrated around the north and became a number of different European tribes, and that all these tribes ended up migrating to England, Scotland, and Wales. So basically, I guess they think the Anglo-Saxons and stuff were descended from them. Um, which we don't. There may be a little bit of truth to that, but we don't buy into British Israelism. There's a lot of garbage in British Israel type, I guess, scholarship. But there are two of the scholars from that kind of camp who've actually done some pretty good work. One of them is, I think, Raymond Capt, and the other one was a Colonel Faskin. And they've both done some pretty good research on what happened to the Israelites who got deported by the Assyrians. And it does appear that they were being called Bitkumri, which kind of just turned into Kumria. And then the K sound kind of got turned to a G to Gomery. And they basically are getting called Gemera or Chimera, which the Greeks call the Cimmerians. And I'm not saying that all the Cimmerians were Israelites, but the group does kind of pop up right as the Assyrian Empire is losing control of those parts, those regions of their northern kind of buffer states. So we have from Sargon's annals that he goes to a region called Mania in Iran, and he conquers them, and he takes this guy who's like a local king named Daaku, which is recognized as Diocese. Well, the Greek diocese is actually pronounced Diokes. It's a hard C, and so it probably would be better to spell it with a K. At any rate, Sargon deports this guy and his son to the west, and he plants them somewhere near Carchemish. In his annals, he says this. And that was the year 713, 714. According to the annals of Herodotus and the other Ctesias and the other sources we have for the Medes, Diocles, his reign began somewhat time between 712 and 708. So we see him becoming king right after Sargon deported him to the west. And then Sargon, his final campaign, he went to put down a rebellion in Tibal, which is the area we were saying is the Hittites in Cappadocia. And he gets killed. He gets ambushed. His army gets ambushed, and he gets killed. And it was a total shock to the Assyrians because this had never happened. And his son Sennacherib, appeared to have been kind of so freaked out by it that he almost like pretended it didn't happen, and he wouldn't mention his father. He just kind of seems to have been very shaken up by it. Well, around this time, we see the rise of the so-called Median Empire. We also see the rise of the Cimmerians, and the Cimmerians had two groups. There's a Western horde, which was based in Cappadocia, and there's an Eastern horde that's based in Mania, which is exactly where Diocles had come from. And so by the year 685, they had basically conquered all of Anatolia. I think they conquered the Phrygians, and King Midas killed himself. So what we've found is that it looks like the kings of the Scythians and Cimmerians can be identified with the kings of the Medes in the king lists, who can also be identified with the New Kingdom Hittites, and that would be Diokes appears to be probably Toukalia III. His son Phraortes, it appears to be the Scythian Bardatua, who an actual, I guess, this pot with his name on it written in Hittite hieroglyphics has been found in Iran. But we'd identify that as Suppiluliumus the First, and the Assyrians refer to him as Mugalu. He then had a son named Arnawanda. He died in the plague, but he's not mentioned by the chroniclers. And then the younger son, Tugdam, becomes king. We think that was Mursilis II, as we discussed in the previous episode. He is succeeded by Magius, who we believe was also the Hittite king Muwatalus II, not because of etymology, but because we place them at the same time and same place in history. He in turn is followed by Sheri Kush, who we believe was Muwatalus III. Not Sheri Kush. I got that name wrong. There's a different name for him in Carchemish that is escaping my memory at the moment. At any rate, he's followed by Cyaxares, who we believe is Hattusilus III, and then in turn is followed by Astyages or Ishtuvegu in the Iranian, who we suspect to be Tudkhali IV, although we're not certain about that one. We haven't found a really strong synchronism to really prove it, other than he's the son of Cyaxares, and therefore it would make sense that they're the same person. There's one more king. There's in the story of how Cyrus defeated Astyages and became the emperor. He's helped by this general named Harpagus, who Astyages had he had punished Harpagus for something in a very cruel way, where he killed his son and served it to him for dinner, and then seems to have forgotten about it. And of course, this could be Greek drama, great exaggeration, because it seems hard to believe that you would serve someone's son to them for dinner and then keep him as a general of your army. uh, but at any rate, supposedly this Harpagus helped Cyrus to, he defected to Cyrus's side and helps him defeat his uncle or his grandfather Astyages. Um, there has been discovered in Turkey a statue of a Hittite king called Hartapu. And this probably, we think he fits the time and he fits the name, not to put too much weight on the name, but it could very well be the person that the Greek story of Harpagus is based on. And at any rate, that's kind of a summary, and we covered some of that in the last episode. The main point I wanted to cover was how Diocles and the founding of the Cimmerians kind of fit together for the founding of the Median Empire. And that kind of concludes my answers to that.
Thank you so much, Ken. We have one more episode on the reconstruction of Egyptian chronology. It's on dynasties 20 to 21. And then we have a very interesting episode on the early history of humanity after the flood and potential memories of that in mythological traditions from around the world. A note for viewers, I'm going to be away for a little over a month. I have my wedding in 1 week, and then I have my honeymoon. So there's going to be a brief hiatus on this series, but then we'll get back into it in July. So thank you so much, Ken. I've really enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. And I wish you all the best for your wedding and your honeymoon. Have a great time.
Thanks so much.